Jonathan Tetmeyer is the Associate Coordinator of Communications for the Alberta Teachers Association, and he's going to introduce our first session today and our speakers. Welcome, Jonathan.
Good morning, folks. I also have the privilege of serving as the Treasurer of Public Interest Alberta, and so in that role, I'd like to draw your attention to your package and give you a second to pull out this white form. This, of course, is the membership form. So while I introduce the panel, I would encourage you to take a couple of minutes to fill out your renewal for your membership and also consider becoming a monthly contributor. If you like this conference, if you like the work of Public Interest Alberta, we could definitely use more support to do more of it. So welcome to day 2. I want to start by thanking Alex Himmelfarb for his humorous and bold and insightful presentation last night. It was simply fantastic. First up this morning, we have a panel discussion talking about Alberta's options, going forward or back. I was struck last night when Larry mentioned that Public Interest Alberta is now 14 years old. And I tweeted that at 14 is now entering its rebellious youth phase. Time to get rowdy.
Yes.
And so in preparing for introducing this panel, I started to think about Alberta actually as a 14-year-old. And I'm a high school teacher. I taught junior and senior high school before I joined to work with the ATA. And so I'm a little bit familiar with 14-year-olds and 14-year-old angst. And, you know, that angst is really driven from this point of adolescence where you're not really an adult yet, but you're definitely not a child at the same time. And so if we think about Alberta sort of stuck in that phase and looking at, you know, not being a child, not being an adult, and thinking about all of those choices. You know, we hope for 14-year-olds to grow up at some point, and frankly, we hope for Alberta to grow up at some point too. But what does that look like? You know, what does a 14-year-old need to do in order to get out of the basement? And what does Alberta need to do in order to get up and get out of the basement and become a bit more responsible? What are the policies that are going to move Alberta forward instead of backwards? And I think that really is what this panel is about. We have a moderator who has quite a bit of experience with youth, and I'll tell you more about that. He will ask the questions of a couple of great panelists who also have their own experiences. They are both parents, and Ricardo has just sort of finished bringing his sons through that adolescence phase and moving them into adulthood. And Gillian has raised her own daughter through that phase as well. So let me introduce the panelists, and I'll start with our moderator. Our moderator is Michael Janz. I first became aware of Michael, as probably many of you did, when he served as the University of Alberta Students' Union president. And I met him at a 2009 conference that was asking pretty similar questions to the ones we are today. I've always found Michael to be very bright and thoughtful, but moreover, he's a very articulate and passionate advocate. He's worked in fields related to social and community development, including work with the Edmonton Federation of Community Leagues and the Alberta Mentoring Partnership. In 2002, he was elected as the trustee for Edmonton Public School Boards in Ward F, and he is now in his 3rd term in that role. He's also served as the chair of the board. In 2016, he was voted Edmonton's best trustee by readers of View Weekly. Bridget Sterling points out that in 2017, he was voted the runner-up.
I'll get it back. I'll get it back.
He's also been recognized as one of Alberta's top 40 under 40s, and he's a new proud father of a young 16-month-old boy. Michael Janz. Michael will ask questions of 2 panelists. The first panelist that I'll introduce is Dr. Gillian Steward. She's a Calgarian author and journalist. She's been watching Alberta politics since the 70s. She has been the managing editor of the Calgary Herald from 1987 to 1990. After that, moving into the early 2000s, she authored a number of publications for the Parkland Institute related to private healthcare, and I'm sure you'll recognize them when I mention the names. Publications like Reclaiming Medicare, a response to the Mazankowski misdiagnosis. Public Bodies, Private Parts, which looked into conflicts of interest at the Calgary Regional Health Authority. And with Dr. Taft, Clear Answers, Economics and Politics of For-Profit Medicine. Since then, she's served as the editor and publisher of Alberta Views magazine. She earned her PhD in Communications and Media Studies and teaches journalism now at Mount Royal University. Recently, she published or wrote the report Betting on Bitumen for the Parkland Institute on Alberta energy policies, comparing Peter Lougheed and Ralph Klein. And she's a regular columnist with the Toronto Star. You may have been drawn to her most recent column, Confused About the NDP. There's good reason for that. And finally, Ricardo Acuña. I've had the privilege of knowing Ricardo for over 10 years, but I've known of his work for much longer. He served as the executive director of the Parkland Institute for over 16 years. He's a regular columnist in View Weekly, and I consider him to be a trusted advisor and consultant, so we regularly bring him into our strategy sessions at the Alberta Teachers Association. He is an observer on the board of Public Interest Alberta, so in that role he sits and often gives us very good advice. He also regularly advises the Edmonton John Howard Society's board, I'm sure amongst others, and my wife is on that board, and so I always get the treat of having my wife come back from board retreats and talk at length about the wonderful stuff she's heard from Ricardo, with no jealousy at all. Anyway, I've considered Ricardo to be the moral conscience of Alberta. He, in many ways, is part of the glue that holds the social fabric of Alberta together, and I really can't think of anyone better to contribute to this conversation about how we need to raise Alberta right through adolescence. So please join me in welcoming Michael, Gillian, and Ricardo.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So just as we're getting the mics set up, how many of you have ever heard of the show Portlandia? Show of hands. It's a satirical show about the city of Portland, and it sort of spoofs all the happenings there. And they opened their first season with a sketch called The Dream of the 90s is Alive in Portland, and it's a spoof about how all the things you wanted to do in the 90s, like go to clown college or have a certain style of dress or listen to grunge rock, you can still do that in Portland. And Dave Berta, right here in the front row, the local blogger, did a spoof sketch, and I'll just read it to you. It's a character named Maggie, and then a gentleman named Jason. And Jason says, "Do you remember the 90s? You know, people were talking about flat taxes and buying paisley neckties, and people were singing about budget deficits and debt and reforming the Senate." Maggie, "Yeah." Jason, "There's a place where that idea still exists, a reality, and I'm leading it." Maggie, "What is it?" "The United Conservative Party. Remember when kids at private schools dreamed of growing up to be Preston Manning? Everybody listened to compact discs and wore Doc Martens? Would stay up until 11 eating pizza takeout and admiring Ronald Reagan? Right, I thought that dream died ages ago. Not in the UCP. So from what I can surmise, it's like the UCP is an alternate universe. It's like Ralph Klein never stopped blowing up hospitals and closing schools. Notley government never happened." Exactly. In the UCP, it's like government doesn't even exist, right? People drive big trucks, they drive double-decker trucks, and there's no carbon tax. Welcome to the UCP. Except there totally is a carbon tax. So with that note, here we are. It's 2019. How do we define the public interest in Alberta? What does it mean to be for the public good? And what political directions will take us closer? So we'll start with opening statements. Ricardo, would you, or Gillian, would you? Yeah. 2 plays.
All right. Thanks, Michael. And thank you, Jonathan, for that introduction. It was a little frightening in many ways, but thank you. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I'm actually going to address the question you asked, Michael. I hope that's okay. We're talking about rebellious teenagers. You can't always do what you're supposed to do, right? Sometimes you just got to do what you feel like. And the reason I don't want to address it is because I always feel awkward when people ask me to define the public interest. I mean, I really don't think that's up to me to define. That's a collective endeavor, that's a collective effort. What we've seen as a role at the Parkland Institute over the years has actually been to try and inform people as they try to identify what the public interest is, but not so much to define it. I think that's our role is to inform, to help people have the information they need to make those definitions, and to trust that collectively the public will, on their own, identify what the best interests are, right? Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we get it wrong. What I do want to talk about, though, is this notion of the going back. And I think we overstate that at our own peril, because it's not 1993. It's not Ralph Klein and Lawrence Decor, right? It's Jason Kenney and Rachel Motley. And one of the things is that the context has changed so significantly since 1993, and that sketch that you read out alludes to that, right? When Ralph Klein took power in 1993, Alberta had a fairly robust income tax system. Alberta still had decent royalty rates. We have neither of those things right now. In 1993, the Overton window, which many of you have heard me talk about, was still moving rapidly to the right. Today, that's not the case. It's not necessarily moving to the left, but it has stalled. In 1993, we were still spending a comparable amount to everybody else in Canada on healthcare and education and social services. That's not the case today. So when we talk about going back and reference that time frame of Ralph Klein in 1993, what Ralph Klein did in 1993 was definitely move backward from what existed. What's happened since 1993 is that we haven't necessarily gone forward. We're still largely facing what we faced, what Ralph Klein did to us in the mid-90s, in terms of funding for healthcare, in terms of funding for education. We're facing a gutted tax system. We're facing a system of gutted royalty rates where we've got no revenue. So the danger now is not that we'll move backwards to 1993, but that we'll move backwards from where Ralph Klein put us. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind, is that we're not faced with this option of, we're going to make it 1995 or we're going to make it 2019. The option we're faced with is we're going to make it 2019 or we're going to go backwards from where we were in 1995. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind as we have these conversations.
Very well said. Gillian.
All right, well, I'm going to do what I was told. No, this will work well because I think Ricardo obviously took us back to the 90s to take a look at that. I do want to actually talk about moving forward and where we could go from here, or what I see as, just particularly from being in Calgary, where we might go. I'm always glad to come to Edmonton because I think in Alberta now we're living in 3 entirely different planets, which would be Edmonton, Calgary, and the rural area. And we have to figure out ways that we're actually going to be able to, talk and compromise with each other from those separate areas. But I think what a lot of Albertans are looking for, and I see this in Calgary, and it fits with what Ricardo was saying in a way, is I think people are looking for some stability. We've had this up and down and in and out and backwards and forwards now for so long that I think a lot of people are just tired of it, and they realize that it's not working for them. And I think one of the things, and I particularly see this in Calgary, is not that people are expecting or even wanting another boom. They want some stability, right? I think people want to know, is my job secure, whether they're in the private sector or the public sector? Or do I have a chance of getting a job next time, because I don't have one right now? there's that sense of, you know, is my future secure? Can I feel somewhat optimistic about the future? And I think that is an issue for a lot of people. It's not so much that they want to boom, or I don't think people are even expecting a boom. Despite all the pipeline wars and all that, I think people know that whoever wins or loses that, we're not going back to the boom days. And even in Calgary, a lot of people in the industry know that it's not going to be the same as it was before, right? That we will always be a province that has oil as part of our economy, but it's not going to be like it has been for the last 50 years. I think people recognize that. But the big question is, what is going to replace it? And I think in terms of the private sector and the public sector, what is going to create wealth? And I don't mean wealth for individual people, I mean wealth for us as a society. If oil isn't going to play the role that it used to play, what is going to replace it? That to me is the big question. And it's a big question. I don't know if it's a big question in Edmonton, because I don't live here, but it's a big question in Calgary. What is going to replace it? You know, is it going to be the tech industry? Well, we don't know. We didn't get the Amazon head office, right, or whatever. You know, what is it actually going to be? Is it going to be the green economy? But does the green economy actually supply the same number of jobs that the oil and gas economy supplies? I don't think so. It can supply jobs. So what is the answer? And I think people are looking for some answers, and they're looking for some stability. I don't think they expect, you know, obviously there are some people that would love it to go back to the 90s or the 80s or whenever the price of oil was $130 a barrel. But I think most people now realize that that's not going to happen. But what is going to happen? And how secure can people feel? How secure can people in the private sector feel? And how secure can people in the public sector feel? And how secure can people feel about their healthcare system, their schools? You know, they're looking after their parents. How secure can they feel about assisted living and long-term care? All those things. I think people are really looking for stability, and that is maybe what will take us forward.
I think many in this room remember the Klein years and how difficult they were, and I don't think we need to revisit that. I think that's kind of commonly understood. But I think another area, in addition to cuts and service levels, is the dangers of privatization. And in some ways, privatization is still very present in Alberta in many forms. Alberta, as you noted, Ricardo, is very much the place that Klein left it. There's still there's some recovery in some areas on spending levels, but the damage that Klein did in many areas hasn't been repaired. So when we look at healthcare, education, seniors care, post-secondary, there's this privatization piece that's still looming that I wonder if we have made progress on, and I wanted to get both of your takes on privatization and what that could mean in 2019 looking forward.
One of the challenges of coming out of this extended period of neoliberal dominance in policy is that that question of privatization. I mean, Alex said last night that we need to be bringing things back under the public sphere, which is a wonderful sentiment that I support fully. But often it's like putting toothpaste back in the tube, right? I mean, it's quite easy. It was quite easy for Ralph Klein to privatize all these things and rake in the money and make the bottom line look good by selling off our liquor stores and our energy company and our phone company and all of that. And given our paradigm, given the trade deals that we've been signed into, it's incredibly challenging now to try and bring those things back. The dominant political flavor is still one that supports public services, but the whole discourse of nationalization is one that's not very kindly looked upon, even by progressive centrists in this country and in this province. So I think that's in terms of our work and pushing that kind of aspect of the public interest forward, it really does mean that we have to engage in those conversations. I mean, the provincial government over the last 3 years has done a great job of not furthering privatizations. In fact, in areas like labs, they've expanded. There's the health sciences folks who worked so hard on that. They've actually expanded the public, and that's one area where we've taken a small step back towards bringing something into the public fold. But I think on some of these larger issues, it's going to be tougher to do, and I think we need to steel ourselves for those battles, and the first step is changing that discourse.
Yeah, and I think, you know, Kevin Taft and I wrote a book about this in 2001, Clear Answers, about what Ralph Klein wanted to do in terms of privatization of healthcare. And I think a lot of the privatization has actually taken place by stealth. You know, when you look at healthcare and hospitals, so much of it is now contracted out to private sector organizations, right? And as Ricardo says, that's like putting toothpaste back in the tube. It's going to be very difficult to wrest control from some of those companies and or corporations. I mean, they're international corporations. It's going to be very difficult to wrest back control and keep costs, you know, the same or down or whatever we need them to be. And also to show that this is actually in the public interest. I think it's going to be a complicated sort of fight. But I think one of the things that we still have going for us is even in Alberta, people want a public healthcare system. Even if it's just a shadow of what it used to be, the idea behind public healthcare is something that people across the political spectrum support, even in Alberta. And I think we have to always remember that. And Ralph Klein lost a lot of fights because he wanted to privatize much more than actually got privatized. But people in Alberta stood up to him on that. And said, even conservatives stood up to him on that and said they didn't want that they want a public healthcare system. And so I think we always have to remember that has to be a guiding light in the, you know, in the struggle for public interest and the kind of society that we want. Even in Alberta, people want that.
We do in many ways need to shift gears as activists, as advocates, as whatever you want to call us. We need to shift gears because throughout that whole Klein period, throughout the whole Conservative period, we were acting defensively on that privatization battle. And I think we've had the opportunity in the last 3 years, and I said, you know, health sciences kind of led the way on the labs. You've been doing work on private schools, right? We've had an opportunity now to actually shift gears and move into offense mode and actually start reclaiming some of these things. And we've had some small victories, but I think we really need to ramp that up.
I wanted to touch on, Gillian, your point about regionalization in Alberta and how, you know, the 3 Albertas you called it, and maybe it might be 6 Albertas if we count some of the other urban centers. I just heard this morning on the radio that Grand Prairie has the highest opioid deaths in Alberta. I think some of the rural communities, if anybody could benefit from a strong public interest, social democratic vision for community, it'd be many of our rural areas that are in decline and have high need. I wanted just to unpack some of the regional interests a bit, and if you wanted to expand on that further.
Yeah, I think in terms of, you know, anger, we hear a lot about anger in this province, right? That people are angry. I have to say, in the cities, I'm not quite sure. I know a lot of people are not doing well, and they have a right to be angry. But there's a lot of people that are doing well and are angry. Like, what are they angry about? I'm not quite sure, right? Other than they just like being angry. You know, I heard recently about a dinner for wealthy UCP donors in which the donors were saying, you know, we need a war on the NDP. And these are all very wealthy people, right? And I'm thinking, what are they angry about? Like, they have everything. And yet they're angry and they want a war. Now, I think in the rural areas, there is some anger, but I think it's a different kind of anger. And I think a lot of it stems from, you know, the fact that people in rural areas tend to think of themselves as more independent, and they see the government as just interfering with what they actually can do on their own. And I think that's, you know, and I may be talking out of turn here because I've never really lived in a rural area, and I'm sure there are people in this room that have. But people in rural areas, it seems to me, believe that they can survive and they can band together on their own and figure things out, that they don't need a government in Edmonton to tell them what to do. And they certainly see an NDP government or a socialist government as interfering much more in their lives than they certainly want. And it was a real coup, I think, for Peter Lougheed in particular, that he was able to somehow bridge all those differences and bring urban people and rural people together in under one tent, as they say, but in one party. And I don't think we've had a political party since then. Well, I mean, the Conservatives were able to do it to a certain extent only because Peter Lougheed could do it. He did it first. I don't think we've had a political party since that's been able to do that. And I think either we're going to live on these 3 separate planets or 2 separate planets, or there will be a political party that can bridge those differences. Whether it's the UCP, I'm not sure, because I don't know how well they actually appeal to the urban people, but we'll see.
There's a very powerful mythology about what Alberta is that drives that, right? It's wrong, but there's this mythology of Albertans as non-urbanites, as frontiers people, as rugged individualists who pull themselves
Blue Dodge Ram.
Yeah, who pull themselves up by the bootstraps and don't need government interfering and don't need taxes and don't need any of that. We're going to take care of ourselves, and it doesn't actually reflect our history in Alberta as the birthplace of the cooperative movement, in Canada as the first place to step forward when collective action is required. As you know, it doesn't reflect our history, but this mythology has taken on a life and a power of its own. And I think until we start telling a different story and make those connections again, that it's going to be difficult for anybody to kind of bring together and unite those identities.
I hate to break it to you, but I think that mythology is quite alive, particularly in southern Alberta, in cowboy country. I really do. Like, you go into areas like around High River, and it's just there. And people are proud of it, right? And in many ways, they have a right to be proud of it.
6th and 7th generation.
6th and 7th generation, this woman is saying, yeah. And they're proud of it. You know, they have ancestors, great-grandparents who started the ranches, and the families continue, and they've survived, they've done well. There are people that have worked the land. Granted, the land originally belonged to the Indigenous people, but still their families are there, and they've been there for a long time. And they see themselves as having, this legacy that they want to continue.
In this next...
Sorry, Ricardo.
No. I like this, and we're going to actually have questions from the audience when Joel gives me the 30-minute wave. And I guess maybe if we can go sort of short answers on the next 3, I want to get into the political parties. So the UCP is essentially the government in waiting, according to the polls. What can we expect from them if they were to achieve a majority? Then I'll ask you sort of the same questions about the NDP and what's the third party again? The Liberal Party? Yeah, no, the Alberta Party? I don't know, the other options, so.
I mean, we don't know, right? It is the quite direct answer in terms of what the UCP will do. We don't know. The promises that Jason Kenney has made, largely to date, are promises he can't deliver on. The getting rid of the carbon tax, all of these kind of constitutional federal challenges, or things he's, building more pipelines, are things he can't deliver, right? We have heard that the UCP will seek somehow to balance the budget within one term in office. We've actually heard the same promise from the NDP. It's their timeline, 2023. But the AUCP has given no indication of how they do that. And they keep saying, well, we'll wait till our policy convention in May, which has got 1,300 resolutions coming before it. And they're saying, well, we won't have a policy document after that. We'll have a policy document when we launch our platform. So we don't know. I mean, they haven't made any commitments to where they're going to cut. They haven't made any commitments to what they're going to do. The only commitment they've actually made is to scrap the carbon tax, and we know they can't
And to oppose GSAs in schools.
Yes, and to oppose GSAs in school, right? And they're going to lose on both those fronts. So, you know, it's anybody's guess. We suspect, because of his politics, that he will be very much a slash and burn and cut kind of a leader, but he hasn't given any indication of what exactly that'll look like. Gillian?
Yeah, I think, I don't know, from listening to Jason Kenney and certainly the people around him, I get the sense that who they really want to appeal to, or who they hope to appeal to, is there's a certain sector in Calgary that really does want things to go back to the way they were. And that means the price of oil has to be high, that oil and gas companies rule the roost, right? Not that they don't have a lot of power anyway, but would have even more. That there's this idea that we would live in the petrostate again, right? That we would live in a one-party state where the oil and gas and petroleum industry would have a lot of power and a lot of control, and we would all be wealthy, right? And it's it's a fantasy. It's the world. As Ricardo said earlier, the world has changed a lot since the early 1990s. Since the boom days of the oil sands, the world has changed a lot, and I really think a lot of people in the UCP just don't seem to recognize that. They seem to want to create, again, Fortress Alberta, where we're going to do it our way. We're going to deny that there's any global warming, climate change. We're going to push ahead. We're just going to keep going because the world will want our oil no matter what. And I think it's a fantasy. I just don't see how they're going to bring people along with them, most people in Alberta along with them on that.
I wanted to ask you about the NDP. I mean, they talked a lot about making life easier for families. They talked about building a pipeline to get our craft beer to Tidewater. Or sorry, I misread that. How have they done when we look at schools, childcare, some of the other priorities, and I guess also how have we seen their team mature in cabinet and in leadership, and what can we expect from their vision going forward from 2019?
Well, I think they really did start at a disadvantage in the sense that they did not have very many experienced people in government, and they had a lot of catch-up to do, and they have done a lot of catch-up. And I think on the social side, on education and healthcare and long-term care and those things that people really come to rely on, they have made advances, or at least they've stopped the regression that we were in. I have to say, I find it really strange the way Rachel Notley has taken on the rhetoric of Jason Kenney when it comes to the pipeline and when it comes to defending oil and gas interests. It's not that I don't understand why she has to do that politically. I do understand that. It just seems really odd to me. I can't quite put the two things together, and I don't know if it's going to make any difference in the end. I do hear in Calgary that a lot of people who I wouldn't normally think would support the NDP saying she's doing a good job in terms of defending our interests, right? They like that. They like the way she speaks up. They like the way that she's so forceful. But on the other hand, I think a lot of people are confused about where is this going to take us and how close to the oil and gas industry is she actually going to become, and is she going to become beholden to them? So I think that's a huge question. And I, for one, don't quite understand why the NDP in Alberta and the NDP in BC can't work it out. Like, I don't get it. Like, come on, people.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think one of the best things that's happened in terms of this government is that they've stopped that backward slide, that privatization, they stopped that rightward move in the rhetoric and on most topics, right? Which is great. I mean, all of a sudden, it's okay in Alberta to run deficits and engage in counter-cyclical spending, right? That's significant. When, from 1993 onward, Ralph Klein made deficits like the crux of all evil, the worst thing any government could do. All of a sudden now Albertans understand the notion of counter-cyclical spending again, right? So I think even just that is a huge gain. But in terms of stopping that decline, they've done great. In terms of actually moving things forward to a more progressive, a more left vision, on a couple of topics there's been progress, but I think overall there really hasn't been a forward movement, right? There's been we're going to stop the damage, and we're going to start to rebuild. And I think the expectations that they could build that kind of forward progress in a 4-year term is perhaps naive on the part of many of us to think, okay, they're in power now and we're going to get everything we ever wanted in 4 years. But I have high hopes for a platform that actually shows a plan to move things forward instead of just stopping the destruction that was happening in Alberta.
Yeah, there's, I think, a lot of areas like campaign finance reform, which we've seen some gains. We've yet to know what the impact will be, but there's so much more I'd like to ask you, but we want to engage the audience as well, too. So, Brett has the mic. If you would like to ask a question, throw your hand up, and he will, he'll turn to you. And in the meantime, as you're ruminating on which question you want to ask, I want to throw it back to the panel. So, I think you talked about, we got Mr. Neff up there. We got two great things that you both talked about. One is preserving the gains that we made and the things that we still have, and the second is advancement. And many of us in this room are very engaged in our communities. We're activists, we're organizers, we have an audience, and we're very busy in our organizations. So in your mind, what is our homework? What should we be leaving here and doing in our communities, in our organizations, in our work? What are the most important things we should be focused on?
I just want to echo Alex. I mean, be unapologetically bold. The government has to focus on getting re-elected. We don't. Our focus needs to be pushing forward bold ideas, transforming the discourse in this province, making it possible for any government that gets elected to actually step in to building something better. So be unapologetically bold in your discourse and in your organizing. And I mean unapologetically in that sense. We spent a lot of time being very careful in the last 3 years of saying, oh, you know, this is really what we want from our healthcare system. And we understand that the NDP government doesn't have the money to do it, or they don't have the resources, or they need to get re-elected, right? Stop apologizing for that. Don't backstep. Say, this is what we want from healthcare. This is what we want in education. This is how many public long-term beds we want in this province. And don't make any apologies. Don't equivocate at all. And keep pushing that discourse forward. I think that's the most important thing.
Gillian.
Yeah, and I'm going to take a note from what Alex said last night, too. I think one of the most important things that he said, and certainly it stuck with me, is, you know, governments will only go as far as they are pushed by civil society. And if they're not pushed by civil society organizations, they will take the easy way out, right? They do have to respond to the public, and they have to respond to people that are pushing and show that they have organizational strength. We've seen that. I mean, we saw that in many of our public health care disputes when Ralph Klein was Premier. When we push back, they notice and they do something about it. They have to do something about it. So I think it's really important for civil society organizations to keep that in mind. And as Ricardo says, even if it's, you know, if you are an NDP supporter, it doesn't mean you can't keep pushing. In fact, if the government sees that you are pushing from that end, they are more likely to adopt that stand than not, right? If you just kind of sit back and don't do anything, then they'll take the initiative and do what is safe for them to do. So I think it's really important. The other thing that I think is really important, and this goes back to the pipeline question, you know, for heaven's sake, like, what about all the union people in Alberta and the union people in BC and the NDP people here and the NDP? Can't we all kind of talk to each other and figure out how we can solve this problem? You know, why are we falling for the Alberta against BC thing? I think it's really destructive, and it's forcing us into camps that we don't really want to be in. But we're in a fight, so to speak, with a neighbor province, which doesn't make any sense, right? Why? That's an old Tory trick to do that. Why are we falling for that? We shouldn't be.
I'd like to again thank our panelists. Great points. So again, keep those hands up. I have a dozen other questions, but really want to hear from you. So make sure Brett sees you. Mr. Lambert, Mr. Neff, the first question. Could you stand, please, just so everyone can hear you? Thank you, if possible.
The question I have is around the idea that governments aren't voted in as much as they are voted out. And we saw that in the last round with the Tories. What are the vulnerable points that the ND are sitting at right now that could see them falling the same way as the Tories before them?
Gillian, do you want to... What's the Calgary take?
On what?
Battleground Calgary. Everybody's looking at Calgary.
Well, you know, I think it's going to be a tough fight in Calgary, right? It really is, and I think the NDs in Calgary are already kind of reorganizing themselves in terms of ridings that they think they want to win, but it's going to be a tough fight. I don't think, to be honest, I don't think the Liberals or the Alberta Party are going to play a role in Calgary at all. I think it's going to be a right-wing, left-wing fight, and I think the NDP are going to be able to hang on to some of their seats, but the problem in Calgary is a lot of those newbie MLAs don't have any profile. Nobody knows who they are. Are you agreeing with me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. They don't know who they are, and that's a real problem. They just don't have any profile, and we're a little late in the game for that.
Beyond that lack of profile, they have actually no organization on the ground. A lot of the folks that got elected in Calgary have no clue who voted for them. Because they weren't running these massive on-the-ground campaigns and stuff. So that's a big challenge. I think in terms of Geralds' question, particularly in terms of the issues, it's this rhetoric around the carbon tax and the minimum wage destroying the economy is very powerful in certain circles in this province. And whether it's true or not, and whether there's any economic evidence, it doesn't matter, apparently, for these folks. They've decided that the carbon tax and the minimum wage increases are what's responsible for the economic downturn over the last 3 years, and that's what they're going to vote on. And it's frightening and scary, but that seems to be the reality.
So if that is their ballot question and they're upset, where do they go? Do they go to the UCP? Do they go to the Alberta Party, or do they stay home? What's your take?
Well, they go. I mean, a lot of them go UCP because the UCP is selling what Gillian said earlier, right? They're selling this mythology that somehow if you elect them, it'll be the good old days again, and oil prices will go up, and Albertans will be rolling in money, and small businesses will stop having to pay minimum wage, and all these great things, right? Like it'll rain gold.
In the back.
Yeah, as Ricardo said, we're not in Shangri-La where we can get everything we want in 4 years. There have been advances made, though. I'd just like to point out a couple that dragged Alberta screaming reluctantly into the 21st century from back in the 90s, and that's with our labor laws, WCB, occupational health and safety, and provisions for the farm workers.
And on the mic. And if you want to introduce yourself as well, too.
Gail Davey from Parkland Institute. That's my boss.
In what way does Parkland do excellent work for Alberta?
I hate to be the optimist in the room. I hate to take that role. But you know, when I think about this, I think about, yes, 2019, but I also think we're going to have an election in 2023, we're going to have an election in 2027, and so on and so forth. And I think that we maybe need to take a longer vision on this. Why this is so important is to move the population, right? Politicians follow, they don't lead. And so I think about Jason Kenney's challenge of trying to hold that coalition together of PCs and Cs and Wild Rose without, and 1,300 conference resolutions, and you know, that I kind of look at this as a longer term problem and longer term issue, and the building that takes place because of the people in this room over the longer term gives me some hope for that longer term future. I guess that wasn't the question.
No, that's a really good point. I mean, King Ralph said, right, like, give me the parade to get out in front of, and I mean, I think the first UCP policy platform was a $700 million tax cut to the 1% richest Albertans. And that caused such uproar that, well, we haven't heard a lot about it since. It may still materialize, but we haven't heard a lot about it since. So what do you think? How do we move the Overton window, Ricardo?
Well, I mean, I think in many ways, what I've said on a few occasions is and this kind of bridges both those comments, is that we, and by we I mean those of us in the activist community, those of us who've mobilized for years and organized and done all these things, we weren't ready for an NDP government. We hadn't done the groundwork and the level of organizing to be able to actually push a friendly government to where they needed to be. And I think that's a lesson for us, that we can't focus so strongly on defense. We need to be prepared to play offense. And should we lose, should we move backwards in 2019, yes, of course, we're going to do a lot of work defending our public services and a lot of work defending the gains we've made, but I think we can't lose sight of being prepared for what might come after in 2023 or 2027 and need to be prepared to pay off. And so if we should get a progressive or friendly government again, after that, we're ready and can push them and can actually move them along the spectrum.
Yeah, I guess that's a good thing to remember, right? So we're going to have an election next year. It's not the last election we'll ever have, hopefully, right? Like it does go on and on. But I think there's some real significant shifts that have taken place. I hear some in Calgary concern about the size of the deficit and the debt and all that. But I don't think people want to worry too much about that at this point. I think they want, as I said earlier, I think they want some stability. They want to know, they want to be able to look ahead with some optimism that their job is going to be secure, whether it's public or private sector, or that they have a chance of a job. Maybe it's not a job that pays as much as the one they had before, but it will be a job. And I think those are the kind of smaller, well, it's not small, a job is really important in your life. Those are the kind of things that people are looking for. They're not looking, so much for the big boom question again, right? I really don't think so. And that's a significant change. That is a really big change. And I think people they want to look forward. They don't want to go back.
Rod Phelan, NDP. A lot of what people base their knowledge on is Facebook memes and 10-second sound bites. So what kind of role is the media going to play in informing the public to get them to where we want them to go? Because I see I'm terribly worried because I see how things happen south of the border. So I'm wondering how that's going to influence who controls the message.
Well, you ask a media question. And I have to say, in Alberta, I find the media scene so depressing. Like, we deserve so much more in terms of, public discourse and discussion and ideas and the whole marketplace of ideas than what we're getting. And so I really, to be honest with you, I don't know, when we have an election next time around, I think basically you're going to see much more money put into advertising and social media and getting the message across that way, because getting it across in our media is just ridiculous, right? Like, we have so little of it. In Edmonton, what do you have? You have the Edmonton Journal, which is a post-media, which is barely surviving. In Calgary, we have and you have the Sun, which are all the same now. The same thing in Calgary. Like, it's four newspapers in one, basically. And then you have social media, where people can basically say and put up anything, regardless of whether it happens to be factual or not. And then you have people talking to each other, which is, of course, very important. But I don't see how we're going to get across the messages, say, from this room that people want to get across. What is the media strategy going to be for that? It seemed to me in the last election there was a lot of money put into advertising. And a lot of those messages actually worked really well. But I think it means raising a lot of money for the PACs, right? And because that's where it's going to come from. And so who's got that kind of money? And how is it going to be used? And all those questions. Because I personally don't think we can rely on what we have, you know, on our so-called mainstream media at this point to delve deep enough into the issues that we're all talking about here to really engage people and let them know what their options are.
When we saw in the municipal election, Kenney was almost toppled by essentially a completely erroneous poll that just totally skewed the whole Calgary race. Duly noted, there's many unforeseen waves ahead.
I think there's a responsibility on us too, right? To not predetermine the outcome of the 2019 election. Yes. And I think there's been a lot of that going on. Michael referred to the UCP as the government in waiting. We're already talking about, we tend to default to a conversation where the UCP's victory in 2019 is not even a question, right? And I think that's dangerous because that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yes, there's polls out there that show them in the lead, right? But how often has gotten it right in the last 10 years anywhere in this country or in North America, right? So let's stop the kind of defeatist language. I mean, let's not be, naive and ridiculous, but let's stop having conversations from a place that reinforce the fact that the UCP is positioned to win.
I do think we as progressives perform better as scrappy underdogs, though. I hear we're 100 votes behind and $100 short, so make sure to go. Another question?
Yes, I'm Joan Techmeyer, and I'm thank the Parkland for making me an accidental citizen. And I'd like to comment about, mention Portland and Enron. Portland had a hold of Enron at that point, way back, and it was for citizens in Calgary that rose up and said no to Enron. That helped them drive them into the wall. About 2 months later, in 9/11. Anyway, and the other comment was Parkland started with my tour was that Cynthia Ramsey, Fraser Institute gal for the health, she came for a health panel, and I started looking at Fraser Institute. And she left in tears, I'm happy to say. And then Gillian talked about stability. And I think what the oil companies want is stability. You remember the World Petroleum Congress in 2000 that walled our city off and stopped people from freedom of walking around downtown and threatened everyone with chaos if they ever had a demonstration anywhere. And that Petroleum Congress was the first one they've had since 1933 in Canada. And it was at the point where they were really ramping up their interest in Canadian resources. So I think you tie all those things together, and Kevin Taft's work has been stunning. And I just, the stability that the industry wants, they've already got through rule of law setting precedents. And in the school systems, in the education system, they've captured the University of Calgary, has suggested that Jack Mintz.
Maybe, Joan, we can take this stability point and give it to the panel there.
Start from there, because you can go on.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, great examples for sure. Let's talk about the royalty review. That was, what do we think there might be follow-up ramifications from that now in this coming election?
The royalty review is problematic. When I said at the beginning, in 1993, the government was actually collecting royalties. Ralph Klein took care of that, and now this government has reinforced it. We're not going to get now another royalty review for a decade. Right? We're stuck with what we've got. This thing has been made. Part of my fear is that because the tax system was tweaked in 2015, we're not going to get another tax regime change in a decade. And that's unfortunate because it's those royalties and how much we're getting from our taxes that actually help determine how much power the oil industry has in our government. Because without charging proper royalties and without collecting taxes properly from individuals, we are completely dependent upon the oil industry to fund our government. And as long as we just remain dependent on them for jobs and for government funding, they have power. So in terms of that stability that Joan refers to, she's correct. I mean, they've got it, right? And our role is to push. You know, we're talking about economic diversification, which is great, but the economic diversification we're engaged in right now is not actually diversification at all, because we're finding more ways to use oil and gas to make money. So I think it's problematic.
Ginger AUP, I was just going to ask you about diversification, because I know that Notley is put, and I work for the government, so I do see the backhand of that, and there is that happening, but it just is the fact that it's going to take time for that diversification to come forward to where it's actually visual to the public, it may cause a problem within the election.
Yeah, I mean, and part of the challenge is that there's a lot of diversification initiatives going on, which is wonderful. The ones that are getting the big money commitments from the government are the ones that are still oil and gas related, so the petrochemical industry in particular, right? The tech industries, the knowledge, the AI, all of these kind of things are getting some support from the government as well, but in terms of comparison of where the money's going, they're much smaller, so it will take a much, much longer time for those to bear fruit. In the meantime, we're running deficits of $10 billion a year, and our debt is growing, and we're not diversifying government's revenue resources. We're just not getting any government revenues, and that's problematic while we wait for this economic diversification to take hold.
So Alex had some great advice yesterday about when we're talking to 10 friends and kicking them in the ass and getting them to scream. And I wanted to bring up that question today. I have no problem kicking my friends in the ass. It's no big deal for me. But what I do have a hard problem with is getting them to scream a bit. And I was curious to know, I know this is an old question, but this is still a relevant question. How do we get, from your perspective, and maybe with focusing on different groups of people who scream more versus less, how do we get them to scream a bit so that we get our ideas across?
I think, you know, in this province, we have a huge reserve of young, enthusiastic, well-educated people, right? And what is it that they want? Like, I have to say, I would love somebody, maybe Parkland could do it, I would love a survey of sort of, you know, 15 to 25, 30-year-olds about what do they want for this province? Like, where do they see it going? And what do they see their future? Where do they see their future, right? Do they see it in the oil and gas industry? Do they see it in public services? What do they see? Because I don't think we're seeing that picture, and yet we have a huge and important reservoir of young, enthusiastic, bright people in this province, right? And what do they want? Do you know what they want?
I know what I want.
What do you want?
I want people to stay on the workforce for a little bit longer, so that not everyone retires and makes it really challenging for the rest of us coming through. I want good health care.
So you don't want people to retire?
I do want them to retire.
Oh, okay.
But I don't want them to feel that they have to walk out the door this instant if they want to. I want opportunity for people to succeed and to learn from them. I want a bit more transition period time and some succession planning than what's currently happening. I want good health care for people. I don't want to be pulling my hair out, worrying about if I've done my job well enough. I'm a nurse that day. And I want to get off the roller coaster that we've been on for the last 30 years in this province. Really.
Stability.
That would be nice.
Yeah. GPs work hours too, right?
Yeah.
We talked.
Yes. Yeah.
What kind of careers do you see your friends going into? Like, what are they doing?
Well, a lot of my friends are nurses.
Well, a lot of my friends are nurses, but I have lots of great friends that do great stuff in terms of being entrepreneurs and working for different organizations and not necessarily wanting to work what their parents worked or what they wanted to see, in weekly hours. And, not everyone wants to work the crazy hours that some others have worked in this province. There's opportunities there as well, I think, to think about stability and some flexibility.
Because one of the things I really notice whenever I see a UCP kind of gathering is how old everybody is, right? They're all gray hairs. Is this really? And I don't think of Alberta as an elder province, really. I don't. I think of it as being really young and dynamic, and yet I think the UCP is really appealing to an older sort of crowd, whereas we have all these young, bright people who are not voiceless, but they're not as out there as they should be.
I think it's interesting here in Edmonton, we've seen huge protests the last 2 or 3 weeks against the University of Alberta Board of Governors over tuition and fee increases and those sorts of things. And if I can editorialize for the moment, I would urge everyone in this room to adopt and mentor a young activist somewhere, even if they're not a part of your union. I think we do really well as a labor movement at educating our own members, but sometimes we got to really reach out to those outside. So programs like Next Up, getting a young person sponsored to come to this conference, providing inroads into labor education is integral for all of us, whether we're currently employed or not.
I agree with you fundamentally. I think that education needs to flow both ways. I think we need to be careful to not be paternalistic as we approach youth activism. I think we need to pay attention to the fact that youth are mobilizing and activating right now, and quite often we write them off as naive or too radical or not pragmatic enough, and I think we need to be aware of that. I think of the young people that got arrested at Kinder Morgan's headquarters in Calgary 2 weeks ago, actually speaking up for something they believe in and taking action. So I think it's important that, yes, we need to create the spaces for them to participate, but we also need to come into it not leading with, we've got so much to teach you about how to organize, but leading with, show us how you're organizing today. Show us what you're doing, how you're mobilizing, so that we can change the ways that we've been organizing since 1970 and maybe make them relevant again.
I saw a joke that showed the high school students protesting in the States, and it said, "Oh no, the socialists are organizing the high schoolers," and then the counter was, "No, it's worse, the high schoolers are organizing the socialists."
I'd like to raise a slightly more ominous concern about what might happen in 2019, and I know there are other elections down the line. But if you think about who's in this room, there are representatives of about 95,000 provincial employees, 35,000 teachers, about 24,000 nurses, health sciences, like a whole lot of people in public services. And Ricardo made the comment that, if the UCP gets in, there's certain things that they won't do. Think about that. That's what they also said about Trump. There's certain things they just won't do because they'll be constrained by circumstances. So specifically, my concern is this. Kenney shares something with Stephen Harper. They were close in ideology. They were both cold-eyed, cold-blooded, cold-hearted, committed people who wanted to accomplish certain things. And so Harper cut 2% off the GST and crippled the capacity of governments to deliver social services, public services, right? And that was the plan, right? Strangled it, cut it. And so you hear, oh, well, there's a 20%, there's a $10 billion deficit. He won't cut 10 billion. He can't just cut 10 billion. Really? Because what if the goal is actually to cut taxes to increase privatization? Because that's what you do. When you cut taxes to the public, that support public sector, you force it into privatization. You force it to. What if this is actually the plan? Where he could smilingly say, yeah, circumstances, financial circumstances require us to cut 20% out of all of these budgets. and then goes ahead and does it and is happy about making those cuts because he doesn't like the public sector and he really likes the private sector, and they're all about individualizing and privateering. So, you know, I guess what I'd like a reaction to is, how serious is that potential? Is this Kenney government likely to be constrained by, well, he certainly wouldn't want to go create all that unemployment. Really?
Yeah.
Does he like you nurses a lot? Does he like you public sector employees a lot? Does he like teachers very much? Like, what if he's actually happy to make those big, big cuts in the interests of financial rectitude? So I guess, what about that possibility in front of us? And I'm saying, of course, that that's another reason to fight if you're in one of these unions and you have a whole bunch of members who maybe don't get it. But maybe a response to that potential of actually massive, massive cuts, and that this isn't just talk, and that Trump wasn't just talk.
Well, I think there's a big difference, as Ricardo said earlier, between now and the early 1990s. When Ralph Klein introduced his cuts, or basically did his slash and burn in the 90s, people weren't prepared for that. And he did it so quickly, and it just kept coming day after day after day after day, that the people who didn't want that were kind of left shell-shocked. People didn't know what to do. The media didn't know how to, they couldn't keep covering it because there was so much happening on a day-to-day basis. Well, now we've had a couple of decades to actually absorb that. And I would say, even in Calgary, that is not looked back on with fondness, right? Like, people do not support that kind of cutback anymore. I think it's generally agreed, even in a lot of conservative circles, that that wasn't a good idea, that that was done badly, and that we have been paying a price for that ever since. And so to be honest, if Jason Kenney does do that, and maybe he will, I don't think it's going to be received the same way that it was in the 90s. I think people will be able to mobilize much more quickly. They will understand what the ramifications of that are much more quickly. And I think it will be much more difficult for him to impose that.
Yeah, that's a cheery thought, I guess, Larry. But I mean, of course, we can't be complacent, right? We can't be complacent and say, oh, it never happened, he'll never do it. There's definitely the potential there for significant cuts. There's definitely the potential there for privatization. But I go back to what I said at the beginning in terms of the political context right now is not 1993. And one of the things that happened in 1993 is that we had two parties that together accounted for about 80% of the popular vote in that 1993 election, advocating the same thing, exactly, right? It was massive cuts versus brutal cuts. Either way, we were going to get them. Both of them advocated zero deficit, zero debt laws. Both of them advocated significant privatization. It was one platform, two parties. And that political context has changed a little bit now. In fact, one of the things, I would maybe say, one of the few things that the communication folks at the legislature and with the NDP have done very well in the last year is create that juxtaposition, create that fear of Jason Kenney and the cuts, to the point where they've succeeded in framing him. And he has been very careful about saying it would be a very slow return back to balance. It would be 2023 all at once. It would be very careful. It would be minimal cuts, right? And I think that shows that we're not headed there. The other thing is in terms of privatization, yes, of course, he's going to move for some. The low-hanging fruit is gone, right? I mean, Ralph Klein took care of the low-hanging fruit in terms of privatization, the phone company. There's still things out there, but they're not things that are going to get privatized overnight. They're things that will have to be hammered at slowly, and that gives us time to organize and prepare for it, and we know it's coming now, right? The ones that I would worry about right off the bat, I mean, of course, the insidious privatization in healthcare will continue. I would be very worried, and I am very worried about Alberta Treasury branches. I think that's an asset that Jason Kenney would have his eyes on, and one that we have to be prepared for him, should he get elected, to come after and come after hard. And I think that's a big battle that we need to be prepared to fight, because it's a significant asset for us and one that we can use moving forward.
I'm worried you're giving them ideas. We have another question. Question in the back and then a question in front. How about this? We've got less than 10 minutes left. So why don't we take 3 rapid-fire questions, and we'll take all the questions and then let the panel respond, and then we'll have to maybe get the break and capture them at the coffee pot.
Thank you. Judy Johnson from Calgary. I'm actually the president of David Swan's board. And when I'm in Calgary and say I'm liberal, I either get pity or disdain until I say I'm on David Swan's board, and then I get, oh, David. What I'm concerned about is, and I'm not into identity politics, what I want best for all Albertans, I think, is a strong third party to keep the government accountable. And so my question is, what role do you see a third party playing? Gillian, you mentioned the Alberta Party and the Liberal Party are not getting very much ink, and they aren't. And that very much concerns me. So I think we need some organized resistance in this province. We need to anticipate Kenney. We should have a third party. What are your responses to that?
Great, we'll take 2 more questions. And I think there is one. Okay, why don't we get 1, 2, and then 3 up here. So, striped sweater, hat, and then...
Thanks very much. My name is Breezy Brian Gregg. I really appreciate what Public Interest Alberta and the Parkland are doing here in Alberta to push forward like progressive agendas. And I appreciate that you're telling us that we should push our government. And I'm here today to push Parkland and to push the Public Interest Alberta, because I think there's a really important democratic issue that you're ignoring, and that is democratic media reform. You're trying to push your message through a media that is totally against you, and they warp you, and they twist your message around, and we're relying on foreign firms to get our message out. Most media is a foreign firm, Facebook's a foreign firm, Google's a foreign firm. I feel like we have to build our own cultural infrastructure. We should build a digital public library in Canada to be the broker for our information, so that we don't have to do that. So I really think that maybe I'm too radical for everyone in here in thinking that, but I wish that Public Interest Alberta and the Parkland would do more advocacy for democratic media reform. Thank you.
Sweater, just back behind you, sweater right there. Take a brief comment and then...
Yeah, just a very quick suggestion that maybe we should respect the photograph of the explosion at the Calgary Hospital, Calgary General, and try to associate Kenney's picture with it.
Okay, and then right up in front at the UNA table. Then we'll let the panel respond to all of those. Also, while we're talking about media here, I do want to note, we do have David Kleinman-Haga, blogger of albertapolitics.ca. If you don't read albertapolitics.ca, you totally should. It's great content. Also on Rabble, and as well, Dave Berta, also great content there too. And in the last election, I had more referrals to my website in Edmonton from Dave Berta than I did the Edmonton Journal. And they were significant, so people are reading the blogs, so share them and get the word out to your friends with friendly sources.
Hi, I'm Anna Johnson. I'm a registered nurse here in Edmonton. Going back to 2015, I took part in the Better Way Alberta campaign that took issues door to door and engaged, I think, Albertans within the conversation. And that all kind of culminated in a radio interview with Jim Prentice on Alberta at Noon, during which he told Albertans to look in the mirror. I think that really kind of created a perfect storm for the NDP to enter in. So this time around, I think Public Interest Alberta has an opportunity with the tax reform campaign to maybe create a petition with it and take that door to door, so that we're having that conversation face to face with Albertans.
Noted as well too. So we have a couple of great suggestions, a couple things. I'll look to Joel that he'll nod and receive. But for the panel, do you want to respond to the last one?
Yeah, I think that the third party question is really interesting. I don't know what the Alberta Party profile is like in Edmonton. Is it higher because of Stephen Mandel, or does it seem to be going anywhere? I don't have a sense of that. I really don't. I'm not sure who they would be, if they are a presence, I'm not sure who they would be taking votes from. Would they be taking them from the NDP or from Conservatives? I'm not sure about what that means. In Calgary, I would say the Alberta Party doesn't really have a presence. They have one MLA, who happens to be my MLA, Greg Clark. But outside...
There's like 2 or 3 now.
Well, oh, that's true, yeah, they do. Yeah, I'm sorry, that was my mistake. But they don't really have a, what I would call a profile or a presence in Calgary. As for the Liberals, they're not doing well in Calgary. I think that's the general consensus, and I don't know about Edmonton. But I really do see, this, the next election, as a two-party, basically, a fight, or whatever you want, competition. And to be honest, I'm actually, a lot of people that said, you know, there's too much polarization, we need more consensus, and I'm thinking, you know what? After so many, almost 50 years of one-party state, it's actually better to have competitive politics, right? It's better to have, you know, actual people out there talking about ideas and strategies and how things are different and what we could do as compared to what they're going to do, instead of all coming in under the one big tent and then a few people on the margins, right? It's not a good way to be. And so I think, you know, in Alberta right now, we're actually learning more about competitive politics than we ever have. And we're learning that it's hard work, right? It doesn't come easy, but I think it's a better thing than what we had before. In terms of the media, yeah, obviously I talked about that, and I don't know how we aren't going to see big changes by the next election, for sure. Whether we will ever see big changes, I don't know. Yeah, the Calgary General Hospital, the picture of the hospital being blown up, I think that's what I referred to earlier. People remember all that. And so if if Jason Kenney starts doing that or talking about that, that is what people are going to remember. They already have experienced that. They know what it's like. And so he won't be talking about something that's completely new. And he also won't be talking in the context of the 1990s, when the idea of, you know, eliminating deficits and getting rid of debts was all over the place. It was kind of conventional wisdom at that point. It's not like that now. And yeah, I think, you know, you need to get out there. Those campaigns during the last election worked really well, and they were asking the right questions. They were posing the right questions at the right time, and it made a huge difference.
Yeah, really quickly, one of the challenges that this government has had is that all of their opposition within the legislature and politically generally came from the right. To have a party to the left of them, I think, would have gone a long way to helping balance the direction they were moving over the last 3 years. So yeah, in my opinion, the more the merrier, but it can't all be parties on the right. Right now, if you place, on the political spectrum right now, if you place the NDP government right in the middle, or slightly to the right of middle, which is where I would say they are, on the larger political spectrum, we can't have every opposition party line up on the right side of that, because there's only one way that our public policy is going to go, that being the case. So yes, more parties, but let's actually be realistic about what we're building and what we need in terms of the interest going forward. The media agreed. If I had a dime for everybody that came to me and said Parkland Institute needs to be researching this, I'd have maybe enough dimes to fund one of those reports. We're a small outfit. We don't have the money that the Fraser Institute does. We can't arbitrarily just say this is a good issue, we need to bring it forward, we need to make it happen. We don't make those things happen without financial support. PIA doesn't make campaigns happen without financial support. So yeah, democratic media, for sure. It's an important issue, it's an important question. Let's find a way to make it happen. And yeah, the campaigns, the way we do campaigns, the way organizations work, will have to change a little bit, given the government's electoral finance laws over the last year, particularly with the activities of political action committees. But talking to people is the way to do it. You know, fundamentally part of what we need to do is change the discourse and alter mythology, and we don't do that by broadcasting, we do that by conversation.
Thank you all very much. We're out of time. You've been a fantastic audience and tremendous questions. I think it's been a really engaging morning. I've learned a lot, and I've taken a lot from our speakers and what they shared, and especially from Gillian, the need for stability and how we need to think about that and what that means for Albertans. And Ricardo, your point about power surrendering nothing without a demand, never has, never will, duly noted, and we got to go out there and be bold. So thank you all very much. Joel, I believe, over to you.
Yeah, I want to say a big thank you to Ricardo and Gillian, as well as Michael, for facilitating such a great conversation.